Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, everyone. We're diving into another fascinating life today.
Yeah, this one's really gets to the core of what we talk about.
Exactly. It's right. It's like, how much of this is just like quirky personality and how much of it is, is there a connection between sort of, I don't want to say mental illness, but, just being different and being brilliant.
Right, right.
And today we're going to be looking at the life of Henry Cavendish.
An 18th century scientist.
Yeah, so 1700s, a long time ago.
A real pioneer.
Yeah. And we're looking at him through the lens of this book by Russell McCormack, The Personality of Henry Cavendish.
Great book.
Yeah, it's great.
Very insightful.
Yeah, and it starts out right from the beginning, kind of throws you right into his personality with this great anecdote.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
So picture this, right? This guy is like seriously wealthy. He's like an aristocrat, and he's got this, like tradesman has come to, he's done some work for him.
Right.
And he's like expecting to get paid. And Cavendish is just like, what's the usual amount?
Doesn't know how to, negotiate a price or anything.
It's like this really basic social interaction, right?
Yeah.
That most people would just be like, oh, yeah, it's, $50 or whatever
It's
it
a
is.
totally normal thing.
And he can't even.
It just shows you right away, just how different he was socially.
Yeah. And it's like, that's what's so fascinating about this guy is that he's like, I mean, we're going to talk about this, but he was such a brilliant scientist.
Years ahead of his time.
Yeah. But then socially, just so awkward.
Yeah.
So let's just lay it out there. I mean, this guy was no slouch in the lab.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he identified hydrogen,
Yeah.
right? Determined its properties,
Yeah.
proved the compound nature of water.
Right.
I mean, he did so much.
And even, think about this. He developed a mathematical theory of electricity that basically anticipated Ohm's law.
Decades before.
Decades, yeah. It's incredible.
So what strikes you about how he approached his work?
I think the thing that jumps out is just how meticulous he was. I mean, everything had to be precise. Everything had to be accurate.
Like more so than other scientists at the time.
Oh, definitely, yeah. He was obsessed with getting it right.
So give me an example. Like, how did this play out in his actual work?
Well, take his discovery of hydrogen, for example.
Okay, yeah.
He didn't just notice it and move on. He really went deep. He isolated it. He carefully measured its density, documented all of its properties.
Wow.
And it was this commitment to detail, this thoroughness that allowed him to definitively say, yes, this is a new element.
So it's like we have this record of his process.
Yeah, and his meticulous record keeping is, I think, one of the things that makes him so fascinating to study, because we really have this detailed window into how a scientific mind worked back then.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we can almost retrace his steps,
Yeah.
Experiment by experiment.
So we have this like front row seat to his scientific process, but then his personal life is
A little different.
a little different.
Yeah.
It's like a complete 180, right?
Well, yeah, the guy was famously shy, extremely shy, hated social interaction, and women, forget about it.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He would communicate with his housekeeper through notes.
Notes. Wow.
He had a separate staircase built in his house to avoid running into the female servants.
Were you serious?
Dead serious.
That's incredible.
And if a stranger, even looked at him, he would just, bolt.
Wow. So this is a guy who was really uncomfortable in social situations.
Deeply uncomfortable, yeah.
But he was also a regular at these Royal Society meetings.
So that's the paradox, right? He was drawn to these intellectual gatherings, but then he would just be silent the whole time.
So it's like this tension.
Totally, yeah. This push and pull between wanting to be part of this scientific community, but just being so incredibly awkward.
So, I mean, how do we even start to try to understand this?
Well, I think one place to start is with his family.
Okay.
So he came from a very wealthy, very influential family.
Aristocrat.
Aristocrats, exactly. And his father, Lord Charles Cavendish, was also a scientist.
Really?
Yeah, and he was very active in the Royal Society.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like Henry had a bit of a leg up in the world of science.
Oh, yeah, for sure. His father was a huge influence, like a mentor to him.
But could the family have contributed to his, his eccentricities as well?
Well, that's what McCormack suggests.
You mean beyond just having a scientific mind?
Right, right. The book talks about this. He calls it a hereditary taciturnity in the Cavendish family.
What does that mean?
Basically, they were just a quiet family.
Everyone was just really quiet?
Yeah, very reserved, not big on talking.
Okay, so that's interesting.
And there's this great anecdote in the book
What is it?
where Henry and his brother are traveling and they come across like a dead body on the side of the road.
Oh my God.
And the brother, turns to Henry and says, "Did you see the corpse?" And Henry just replies, "I did."
That's it?
That's the whole conversation.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it seems like being uncommunicative was like a family trait.
So we have the family background, but then we also have, his upbringing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, he was raised as an aristocrat, very formal, lots of emphasis on social distance.
So could that have also contributed to his social anxiety?
Oh, yeah, I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if you're already inclined to be a bit shy, then being raised in that kind of environment.
It could make it worse.
Totally.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there's also the possibility that he was just, an extreme introvert.
Yeah, that's another lens we can look at this through.
So what are we talking about when we say introversion?
Well, I mean, it's basically a personality type where people prefer to be alone. They find social situations draining. They need time to recharge.
Okay.
And a lot of Cavendish's behaviors fit that, right? The avoiding crowds, the discomfort with small talk.
Right.
Maybe he just found the whole social world exhausting.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then there's another possibility that's been raised, which is
A bit more delicate.
a bit more delicate, yeah, that he might have been on the autism spectrum.
Right. And, we have to be really careful here. We can't just go around diagnosing people from the past.
Right, of course.
But it's an interesting idea to consider.
What makes you say that?
Well, there are certain aspects of his behavior that, when you look at them through a modern lens, could align with autism.
Like what?
Well, his extreme social anxiety, for one,
Okay.
his rigid routines, his need for sameness, his sensitivity to sensory input.
So, even though we can't know for sure, it's still an interesting question to ask.
Definitely. I mean, it makes you wonder if his scientific brilliance was somehow connected to a mind that worked differently.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so fascinating about this whole Mad Genius thesis.
Absolutely. It's not about labeling people, but about understanding the complexities of the human mind and how it can manifest in different ways.
Yeah, and how those different ways of thinking can lead to incredible breakthroughs.
Exactly.
So before we go too far down that road, though, I think we should dive a little deeper into his actual scientific work and see what we can learn from that.
Yeah, good idea. I think one of the things that's really striking about Cavendish is how his personality, his quirks and his anxieties, they actually seem to have informed his approach to science.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, like he was almost obsessive about accuracy and precision. It wasn't enough for him to just observe something,
He had to really understand it.
Exactly.
Break it down.
Yeah, he wanted to quantify it, measure it, understand the underlying principles with absolute precision.
Wow. So it sounds like he was working at a level of detail that was kind of unusual for his time.
Oh, absolutely.
So, how did that actually play out in his work?
Well, let's go back to the hydrogen discovery.
Okay.
He didn't just stumble upon it, He didn't just say, "Oh, look, a new gas," and move on.
Yeah, right?
He went all in, meticulously isolated it, measured its density, documented every single property.
That's incredible.
And it's that kind of dedication, that thoroughness, that allowed him to definitively identify hydrogen as a new element.
So he was really setting a new standard for scientific rigor.
Absolutely. And because of his meticulous record keeping, we have this incredibly detailed account of his process.
It's like a window into the past.
Exactly. Like we can almost step back in time and see how a scientific mind worked in the 18th century.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think about.
And I think it's worth emphasizing just how revolutionary his work on gases was.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, today we take gases for granted, but back then they were a pretty new frontier.
Right, like people didn't really understand what they were.
So how did Cavendish approach them?
Well, he called them factitious airs, which kind of shows you the limited understanding at the time. But he recognized that these airs weren't just some, amorphous substance. They were distinct entities with unique properties.
So he was essentially laying the groundwork for modern chemistry.
Exactly. He was way ahead of his time.
And he did all this with pretty limited technology, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about it. No fancy microscopes, no sophisticated analytical tools.
Just his own ingenuity.
Yeah, just him and his dedication to precision.
And his work with electricity was equally groundbreaking.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, he basically anticipated Ohm's law.
Decades before Ohm's.
Decades, yeah. That's wild.
I know, right? And Ohm's law is like a fundamental concept in electricity.
Yeah, it describes a relationship between voltage, current, and resistance.
Stuff that powers our entire world.
So how did he even approach this kind of work with the technology available back then?
Well, it's actually pretty ingenious.
What did he do?
Since he didn't have, tools to measure electrical currents precisely, he used his own body as a measuring device.
You're kidding.
Nope. He would subject himself to electric shocks
Wow.
of varying intensities, and he would carefully note his physical response to try to quantify the strength of the current.
That's incredible and kind of dangerous.
Yeah, a bit risky to say the least, but it shows you how committed he was to pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
No pain, no gain, right?
Right. Except in this case, maybe a little bit of pain.
So, I mean, this brings us back to this whole mad genius idea.
Yeah.
Was his social awkwardness, his almost obsessive focus on his work, was it a hindrance or a contributing factor to his discoveries?
It's a great question, right? Like, did his personality actually help him see things that others missed?
I mean, there's this romantic image of the solitary genius, right? Toiling away in isolation.
Yeah, the lone wolf uncovering the secrets of the universe.
But science is also a collaborative process, right? It requires communication and sharing ideas.
Absolutely, and Cavendish wasn't great at that.
Yeah, he didn't publish a lot of his work.
A lot of it came out after his death.
So you could argue that his reluctance to share his findings actually slowed down scientific progress.
It's definitely a possibility.
And it's like his personality was both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
This incredible ability to focus, to see patterns that others missed, but then this inability to really engage with the scientific community.
And that's why I think this whole mad genius conversation is so important.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think about the relationship between creativity, personality, and maybe even mental differences.
Like, it's not about labeling people or romanticizing mental illness, but acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience.
Right, and understanding that brilliance can manifest in all sorts of ways.
So before we jump into possible explanations for his behavior, I want to talk about one more aspect of his legacy.
Okay, what's that?
Well, beyond the specific discoveries, he really embodied a new approach to scientific inquiry.
Oh, yeah, totally.
This emphasis on meticulous experimentation, rigorous measurement, a relentless pursuit of accuracy.
He wasn't just finding things out, he was setting a new standard for how science should be done.
Exactly, and there's this great story in the book
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
where this visitor comes to his lab and sees all his equipment and says, "What wonderful discoveries must come from here."
And what did Cavendish say?
He says, "It is not discoveries that I look for, but rather the process of discovering."
That's so Cavendish.
It really sums up his whole approach, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey.
The pursuit of truth.
Exactly.
So I think we've laid a good foundation here.
We've talked about his genius, his impact, but now let's get into the man himself.
Yeah, let's explore what might have shaped his personality, what might explain his unusual social behavior.
And maybe we can start with this idea of introversion that we touched on earlier.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so we've talked about Cavendish's scientific brilliance. We've touched on his quirks, his social anxieties.
Right, and now I think we can delve a little deeper into, possible explanations for his behavior.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
And, we were talking about introversion earlier.
Right, and I'm curious to, unpack that a little bit more. How does that lens help us understand him?
Well, introversion is basically, it's a personality type where people, they generally prefer solitude. They find social settings a bit draining, They need time to kind of recharge after being around a lot of people.
Okay, yeah.
And a lot of Cavendish's behaviors really fit that description, right? Like his avoidance of crowds, his discomfort with small talk.
Right. It's like he was wired differently.
Yeah, like he found solace and energy in being alone rather than in the hustle and bustle of social life.
And, his scientific work, it required such intense focus, such meticulous observation. It's like that kind of environment, solitude, might have actually been beneficial for him.
Exactly. It's easy to imagine someone with an introverted disposition finding the quiet of the lab, a perfect setting for deep thought and really concentrated work.
It's like the lab was his sanctuary.
Yeah, a place where he could escape the demands of the social world.
And maybe his scientific success was actually intertwined with his introversion.
That's an interesting thought.
Like those countless hours spent alone in his lab, just meticulously documenting everything, poring over data. Maybe that was fueled by a personality that thrived in solitude.
It really challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a genius, right?
Totally, yeah.
It's not always about being the life of the party. Sometimes it's about being the quiet observer, the one who sees what others miss.
Right, right. But, we also talked about this other possibility, this idea that he might have been on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, and again, we need to be cautious here. We can't diagnose someone who lived centuries ago.
Of course, of course.
But it's still a valuable exercise to kind of look at his behaviors through a modern lens.
So what are some of the specific traits that point towards this possibility?
Well, there are several. His extreme social anxiety, for one, and then his rigid routines, his insistence on sameness, his sensitivity to sensory stimuli. These are all things that can be associated with autism.
Okay.
There's this anecdote in the book about how Cavendish had a specific chair in the Royal Society meeting room that he always sat in.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And if someone else happened to be in his chair, he would just leave.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, like he needed that predictability, that sense of routine.
It's like social interactions were just too overwhelming for him to navigate.
Right. Whereas his lab, it offered him a controlled environment where he could dictate the terms, where everything followed a precise protocol.
And his ability to focus, to meticulously document everything, to find patterns in all that data. Those traits, I mean, they're obviously signs of a brilliant scientific mind, but could they also be seen through the lens of autism?
Absolutely. I mean, many people on the spectrum have this incredible capacity for intense concentration, for detailed observation.
So it's like maybe the very same traits that made social interactions so challenging for him were actually instrumental in his scientific success.
It's a really thought-provoking idea.
Yeah, it makes you question our assumptions about what's considered normal and how different minds can achieve brilliance.
And that's really the heart of the Mad Genius Thesis, isn't it?
It's about looking beyond labels, recognizing the interplay of creativity, personality, and these, what we might perceive as mental differences.
It's not about romanticizing mental illness or saying that all geniuses are somehow mad, but it's about acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience.
Absolutely, and recognizing that brilliance can emerge in all sorts of unexpected ways.
So I think, the biggest takeaway from Cavendish's story is that genius often defies easy categorization.
It's messy, it's contradictory, it can even be uncomfortable.
But it's in those cracks, those spaces where expectations fall apart, that we often find the most groundbreaking discoveries.
And ultimately, that's what makes exploring these lives so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. So I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into the enigmatic life of Henry Cavendish, this brilliant, socially awkward scientist whose story really challenges our understanding of the relationship between brilliance and the human mind.
It's been a great discussion.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope this has sparked your curiosity, and we'll see you next time on the Mad Genius Thesis.